The war had ended with the kind of silence that made people uncomfortable, as if the universe itself was unsure whether it was allowed to breathe again. Across the HFY Pact, fleets drifted in orderly formations that no longer needed to fire, in stations once filled with urgent voices now echoed with the quieter language of repair, accounting, and reluctant reflection. It was in this silence that Queen Arath found herself seated before a wall of reports, each one attempting to compress chaos into something manageable. She preferred chaos if she was being honest. Chaos, at least, did not pretend to be neat. Her long ears angled slightly backward as she skimmed another document. This one was full of decorative phrasing, a commander describing his heroic resistance against overwhelming odds, which when translated into actual numbers, appeared to mean he had retreated early and survived by accident. Arath exhaled slowly. "Another masterpiece," she said. An advisor standing to her right nodded with the seriousness of someone who had never laughed in his life. "The phrasing is enthusiastic. That is a polite way of saying inaccurate," Arath replied, closing the report with a soft tap. "If enthusiasm could win wars, we would not have needed fleets." She reached for the next file without much expectation. The title was unremarkable, a combined unit record from a sector that had seen heavy conflict. Her eyes moved across the first lines and then, almost immediately, stopped. There was no introduction, no contextual flourish, no attempt to impress. Just a line. Engaged hostile force, reduced threat, secured survivors. Arath blinked once, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more familiar if given time. They did not. She leaned slightly forward, one hand resting against her chin, her gaze sharpening. "Is this incomplete?" The advisor stepped closer, peering at the display. "It appears to be a full report, Your Majesty." "That is unfortunate," she said. She scrolled further. "Another entry, intercepted incoming fleet, adjusted formation, enemy losses exceeded projections." Her ears shifted again, this time forward, a subtle sign of interest. There were no adjectives, no embellishments, no indication that anything extraordinary had occurred. And yet, as she cross-referenced the data, the outcomes told a different story entirely. Entire engagements had turned in favor of Allied forces under this individual's presence. 9 times. She paused on the number, letting it settle in her mind like an object that did not belong in the room. 9 victories, she murmured. "Yes, Your Majesty," the advisor confirmed, though his tone suggested he had only just noticed. "No commendations requested," she added. "That is, unusual." "That is suspicious," Arath corrected gently. She opened a secondary panel, pulling up the associated personnel file. The name appeared without ceremony. Dorn. No additional titles. No extended service annotations beyond what was strictly required. His record, much like his reports, seemed to resist expansion. Arath tilted her head slightly. "Who supervised him?" The advisor hesitated, scrolling quickly. "Multiple commanding officers, Your Majesty. None for extended periods." "And their evaluations?" The advisor cleared his throat. "Inconsistent." "Define inconsistent." One described him as reliable to the point of discomfort. Another stated, "He solves problems before they become visible." A third, Ick wrote, "I am not entirely sure what he does, but things stop going wrong when he is nearby." Arath's lips pressed together, the faintest trace of amusement flickering across her expression. "That is not an evaluation. That is a confession." "Yes, Your Majesty." She leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting across the chamber, where other advisors pretended not to listen while very obviously listening. This was how information moved in a court, quietly, inefficiently, and with great enthusiasm. "Has he been interviewed?" she asked. "No, Your Majesty." "Has he declined interviews?" "There are no records of him being asked." Arath blinked slowly. "No one thought to ask?" The advisor shifted, clearly uncomfortable. It may have been assumed that his lack of visibility indicated a lack of importance. Arath looked back at the report, her fingers lightly tapping against the surface. 9 victories, she repeated. "Yes, and no one considered that important." A pause. "When you say it like that, Your Majesty?" "I am saying it exactly like that," she replied. She scrolled through another entry, this one detailing a battle that had nearly resulted in the loss of an entire HFY fleet. The summary was once again absurdly simple. Repositioned Allied units. Enemy advance neutralized. Arath stared at the line for a long moment. Repositioned, she echoed. Yes, Your Majesty. She glanced at the casualty projections, the recorded enemy losses, the survival rates of Allied forces. Numbers that should have required pages of explanation were sitting quietly beside a sentence that barely qualified as effort. One of the advisors in the background finally spoke, unable to contain himself. Perhaps he is minimizing his role for strategic reasons. Arath turned her head slightly. Strategic modesty? It is not unheard of. It is also not useful, she replied. The advisor opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently deciding that silence was the better strategy. Arath allowed herself a small breath of laughter, the sound light but sharp. If this is modesty, it is the most aggressive form I have ever encountered. She returned her attention to the file, her curiosity now fully engaged. There was no pattern of self-promotion, no hidden requests for recognition, no subtle attempts to elevate his position within the hierarchy. Dorn's record existed as if it had been written by someone who did not expect it to be read, which Arath realized might be exactly the case. Her ears angled forward once more, a clear sign now. Interest had become focus. Summon him, she said. The advisor hesitated. Your Majesty? Dorn, she clarified. The quiet one who apparently wins battles by repositioning things. Yes, Your Majesty, but I would like to meet the man who writes like this, she continued, her tone calm but firm. I am beginning to suspect that the reports are not the most unusual thing about him. The advisor nodded quickly. At once. As the command was relayed, Arath remained seated, her gaze resting on the final line of the report. Secured survivors. No names. No numbers. No indication of scale. Just a result. She tapped the screen lightly, as if testing whether it would reveal more under pressure. It did not. Either he is the least interesting soldier I have ever encountered, she said softly, almost to herself, or the most. In the distance, beyond the vast windows of the palace, a fleet drifted in quiet formation, its weapons dormant, its purpose temporarily undefined. The war was over, but something Arath suspected had only just begun, and for reasons she could not yet explain, she found that far more interesting than any victory. The doors to the audience chamber opened with a controlled, ceremonial precision that suggested importance, history, and at least 3 committees arguing about hinge alignment. Dorn stepped through them as if they were just doors. He paused briefly, not out of awe, but because a guard subtly gestured that stopping was part of the process. Dorn nodded, adjusted his stance by exactly 1 unnecessary degree, and waited. Across the chamber, Queen Arath observed him without announcing it. Her posture remained composed, but her long ears angled slightly forward, catching every small sound. The shift of his boots, the quiet hum of the chamber's energy field, the faint, confused whisper of an advisor who had clearly expected something more dramatic. That's him, one whispered. That's him, another confirmed. He looks normal. Arath almost smiled. Normal, she had learned, was often a misleading category. Approach, she said. Her voice carried effortlessly across the chamber. Not raised, not forced. Simply certain. Dorn walked forward, not too fast, not too slow. He did not count his steps, but they landed with the consistency of someone who didn't need to. He stopped at the designated distance. There was a pause. This was usually where something happened. An elaborate bow, a rehearsed greeting, a moment of visible nervousness. Dorn, having apparently not been informed of this expectation, simply stood there. Arath waited. Dorn waited. An advisor coughed. Dorn glanced briefly toward the sound, then back to Arath. Is this the part where I say something? He asked. A ripple moved through the chamber. Arath let the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then inclined her head slightly. It can be. Dorn considered that. Hello. The advisor, who had coughed earlier, made a small, distressed noise. Arath's expression remained composed, But there was a flicker in her eyes now, something sharper, more engaged. "Hello, Dorn." Another pause. "Do you prefer formal address?" she asked. "I respond to my name," Dorn said. "That is not what I asked." "I don't mind," he added after a brief moment of thought. Arath leaned slightly forward. "Good. That simplifies things." She gestured subtly, and one of the displays behind her illuminated, projecting the familiar lines of his report into the air between them. Dorn glanced at it, then back at her. "You wrote this," she said. "Yes." "No additions? No omissions?" "No." Arath tilted her head, studying him more closely now. "You described 9 engagements here." "Yes." "In each of them, your actions resulted in a decisive shift in outcome." "That seems accurate." A quiet murmur moved through the chamber again. Arath ignored it. "You did not request commendation," she continued. "No." "Why?" Dorn's gaze drifted slightly to the side, not avoiding the question, but checking it, as if making sure it was the right one. "I didn't think it was required," he said. "It is not required," Arath replied. "It is expected." Dorn nodded once. "I see. You did not follow that expectation." "No." "Why?" Dorn paused. This time the pause felt different. Not empty, but genuine. He was thinking. "It wouldn't change what happened," he said. Arath's ears shifted slightly, catching the tone of his voice as much as the words themselves. There was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to justify or persuade, just a statement. One of the advisors leaned toward another and whispered, "Is that an answer?" "I believe it is his only one," the other whispered back. Arath continued, her focus unwavering. "Recognition serves more purposes than altering outcomes." "Yes. And yet you chose not to pursue it." "Yes. Do you understand why others would?" Dorn nodded. "Yes." "Do you disagree with them?" "No." Another pause. "Do you agree with them?" Dorn hesitated, just slightly. "I don't think it matters." The advisor from earlier closed his eyes briefly, as if enduring a minor existential crisis. Arath exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in something closer to adjustment. The conversation was not behaving as expected, and she was beginning to understand that it would not. "Tell me about the second engagement," she said, shifting direction. Dorn glanced at the projection again. "The one near the outer ring?" "Yes." "There was a fleet approaching from 2 vectors," he said. "Their timing was slightly off." "Slightly?" 3.7 seconds. A faint stir moved through the technical officers present. "That is not a significant delay," one muttered. Dorn glanced toward him. It was enough. Arath's gaze sharpened. "Explain." Dorn nodded. "If both groups had arrived simultaneously, their combined pressure would have exceeded our defensive capacity. Since they didn't, I adjusted our position to engage them sequentially." "That is what you mean by adjusted formation," Arath said. "Yes." "And the enemy losses?" "They didn't adapt quickly enough." The same officer frowned. "That would require precise timing and predictive modeling beyond standard combat algorithms." Dorn considered that. "I didn't use an algorithm." "What did you use?" Dorn looked at him. "I watched them." The officer stared. Arath's lips curved, just slightly. "Of course you did," she said. Dorn nodded, as if that settled the matter. Another advisor leaned forward. "You're saying you anticipated their movement patterns in real time?" "Yes." "Based on what data?" Dorn paused again. They hesitated before committing to the second vector. "That is not data," the advisor insisted. "It was enough." Silence settled over the chamber again, but this time it was different. Less confusion, more recalibration. Arath leaned back slightly, her gaze never leaving Dorn. "You are aware," she said slowly, "that what you describe is not considered simple." Dorn blinked once. It felt simple. A quiet laugh escaped someone in the back, quickly suppressed. Arath allowed the moment to breathe, then spoke again. "You understand why I summoned you?" "Yes." "Do you?" Dorn paused, then nodded. You wanted to confirm the reports. And they're accurate. Another pause. Arath studied him carefully as if searching for something beneath the surface. Some hidden layer of intent, ambition, or performance. She found none. You are either very straightforward, she said, or very skilled at appearing that way. Dorn tilted his head slightly. Those sound similar. For a brief moment, the queen of the HFY pack looked genuinely amused. Yes, she said softly, they do. And somewhere in the chamber, an advisor quietly gave up trying to understand what was happening. The chamber did not return to its previous rhythm after Dorn's answers. It shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a system recalibrating around an unexpected variable. Queen Arath noticed it immediately. Her advisors spoke less confidently, her strategists leaned forward more often, and even the ambient hum of the palace system seemed, for a moment, too loud. Let us choose one engagement, Arath said, her tone calm but deliberate. Not the simplest, not the most dramatic. Something inconvenient. Dorn nodded slightly. They were all inconvenient. A faint sound escaped from somewhere in the chamber. Half laugh, half sigh. Arath's long ears angled forward again. The fourth report, she decided, outer debris field near Kethra's shadow. A projection shifted in the air, revealing a chaotic map of fragmented asteroids, drifting wreckage, and scattered signal interference. Even looking at it made several officers uncomfortable. That battle was considered unwinnable, one of them said. Dorn looked at the projection. It wasn't ideal. That is not the same as winnable, the officer replied. Dorn seemed to think about that. It worked out. Arath lifted a hand slightly, silencing further commentary. Explain. Dorn stepped a little closer to the projection, not dramatically, just enough to see it more clearly. He pointed at a cluster of debris rotating slowly through the field. The enemy ships entered here, he said. They expected us to retreat. And you didn't, Arath said. No. Why? Dorn's finger moved slightly, tracing a path through the debris. The field was unstable. Their larger ships couldn't maneuver well. That would limit both sides, a strategist pointed out. Yes. Then why engage at all? Dorn lowered his hand. Because they thought we wouldn't. There was a pause. One of the advisors frowned. That is not a tactical advantage. That is optimism. Dorn glanced at him. It was predictable. Arath's gaze sharpened. Go on. They entered with confidence, Dorn said. Too much of it. They committed their larger vessels first, expecting to control the space. And you allowed that, Arath said. Yes. A murmur passed through the chamber. You gave them the advantage? Another officer asked, incredulous. Dorn shook his head slightly. I gave them what they wanted. That is worse. It worked. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly reconsidering his entire understanding of strategy. Arath leaned forward, her interest now fully engaged. What happened next? Dorn gestured again toward the projection. The debris shifted. That is not unusual, Arath said. No, Dorn agreed, but I had been watching the pattern. Several heads turned at that. You predicted the movement of an unstable debris field? One of the engineers asked. Dorn nodded. It wasn't random. It is absolutely random, the engineer insisted. Dorn looked at him for a moment. It wasn't. The engineer blinked, then looked at the projection again, as if it might apologize. Arath spoke before the argument could grow. And this pattern allowed you to reposition. Yes, she almost smiled at the word now. You moved your forces through the debris as it shifted, she said. Yes. And the enemy? They didn't adjust in time. A quiet stillness settled over the chamber. Arath studied the projection, then Dorn, then back again. You used the environment as a weapon. Dorn tilted his head slightly. I used it as it was. That is not the same thing. It worked the same way. A soft, reluctant laugh escaped from one of the younger officers. He quickly straightened when several others looked at him. Arath allowed the moment to pass before speaking again. Your report says utilized environmental conditions. Yes, that is a remarkably small way of describing what you just explained. Dorn considered that. It seemed sufficient. An advisor muttered under his breath, He could describe the collapse of a star as light adjustment. Dorn glanced at him. That would depend on the star. The advisor stared at him. Arath turned slightly, her expression carefully neutral, though there was a clear shift in her tone now. Less formal, more curious. You understand that most commanders would have written this differently. Yes. They would have emphasized the risk, the precision, the scale. Yes. You did not. No. Why? Dorn paused again, that same quiet, genuine pause. Those things already happened, he said. Writing them differently wouldn't change them. Arath's ears moved subtly, catching something in that answer. Not just the words, but the absence behind them. You see no value in interpretation, she said. I see value in clarity. Another silence, but this one felt steadier. One of the strategists stepped forward slightly, unable to hold back. If I may, Your Majesty. Arath nodded. The strategist looked at Dorn. You claim this was predictable, that you simply observed and acted accordingly. Yes, and yet none of our systems, none of our models, none of our experienced commanders identified this opportunity. Dorn listened without interruption. Why you? The strategist asked. Dorn thought about it. I was there, he said. The strategist stared at him. That is not an explanation. It's the only one I have. A few quiet chuckles moved through the chamber, not mocking, but resigned. Arath leaned back slightly, her gaze still fixed on Dorn. You reduce everything to its simplest form. I try to. Does that ever fail? Dorn considered that question longer than the others. Yes, he said finally. And what do you do then? I stop simplifying. That answer lingered in the air longer than any before it. Arath studied him in silence, her mind moving through possibilities, interpretations, conclusions that refused to settle. There was something deeply unusual about him, not in what he did, but in how he understood what he did, or perhaps how he didn't. You make it sound easy, she said. Dorn shook his head slightly. It wasn't easy, but you describe it that way. Yes. Why? Dorn looked at the projection again, then back at her. Because it's over. Another pause. And then, unexpectedly, Arath laughed. Not loudly, not formally, but genuinely. The chamber froze for a fraction of a second. That, she said, still smiling faintly, is either the most reassuring or the most concerning answer I have heard today. Dorn nodded. I'm not sure which. Arath's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was warmth in them now, a growing recognition of something she had not anticipated. Yes, she said quietly. Neither am I. And for the first time since the war had ended, the uncertainty did not feel like a problem. It felt like the beginning of one. The court did not adjourn after the explanation of the debris field engagement. That in itself was unusual. Normally, such sessions concluded with a formal summary, a carefully worded acknowledgement, and at least one unnecessary declaration of strategic brilliance. Instead, no one seemed particularly eager to leave. Queen Arath noticed this. More importantly, she noticed why. Dorn had not changed. The court had. Remain, she said, just as a few advisors subtly shifted their weight in preparation to retreat. They stopped immediately. Dorn, who had not been planning to leave anyway, remained exactly where he was. Arath rose from her seat, stepping down from the elevated platform with a quiet, controlled motion. The chamber adjusted around her, attention following her descent as naturally as gravity. She stopped a few paces from Dorn. Up close, the differences were clearer, not in his appearance, which was entirely human, but in the way he occupied space. He did not lean into the moment, did not brace against it. He simply stood, as if presence required no effort. Arath circled him slowly, not in intimidation, but in observation. You are aware, she said, that my court is attempting to understand you. Dorn nodded. Yes. Are you helping them? Dorn thought about it. I'm answering questions. That is not always the same thing. I've noticed. A quiet snort escaped from somewhere behind them. Arath stopped in front of him again, her long ears tilting slightly as she studied his face. Let us try something simpler. Dorn waited. "What do you think you did in those battles?" she asked. Dorn blinked once. "I solved problems." "That is not simple," Arath replied. "It felt simple at the time." One of the senior tacticians stepped forward, unable to resist. "With respect, Your Majesty, I would like to test that statement." Arath gestured lightly. "You may." The tactician activated a projection, replacing the previous battlefield with a new scenario. This one was hypothetical, a simulated engagement constructed from multiple past conflicts. Variables shifted constantly, probabilities recalculating in real time. "A standard predictive exercise," the tactician said. "We use it to evaluate strategic thinking." Dorn looked at the projection. "It's busy." "It is complex," the tactician corrected. Dorn nodded. "Yes." The tactician crossed his arms. "Given these conditions, what would you do?" Dorn watched the simulation for a few seconds. The room grew quiet again. That particular silence that comes from expectation. "Nothing," Dorn said. The tactician stared at him. "That is not an answer." "It is." "You would do nothing?" For a moment, the tactician frowned. "Why?" Dorn pointed at a cluster of units near the edge of the simulation. "They're about to move." "They haven't moved," the tactician said. "They will." "How do you know?" Dorn looked at him. "They're hesitating." The tactician opened his mouth to respond, but the simulation updated before he could. The units moved. There was a brief collective pause. Dorn continued, "If I act before they move, I'll commit to the wrong position." The tactician glanced at the projection, then back at Dorn. "And after they move?" "Then it's obvious." A faint laugh slipped out from one of the younger officers again. This time, no one told him to stop. Arath watched the exchange carefully, her attention not on the simulation, but on Dorn. "You wait," she said. "Yes, that is your strategy." "Sometimes." "That sounds like inaction." Dorn shook his head slightly. "It's timing." The tactician exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "You're reducing a multivariable engagement to a waiting." "I'm not reducing it," Dorn said. "I'm ignoring the parts that don't matter yet." Another silence. Arath's ears shifted again, catching the subtle change in the room. The way resistance was giving way to reluctant consideration. "You decide what matters," she said. "Yes." "And you are always correct?" Dorn paused. "No." The admission landed more heavily than any confident answer could have. "What happens when you are wrong?" Arath asked. "I adjust." The tactician gave a small, helpless laugh. "Of course you do." Dorn looked at him. "What else would I do?" The tactician didn't answer. Arath turned slightly, addressing the room without fully taking her eyes off Dorn. "You have all spent years refining models, constructing predictive systems, developing layers of analysis." There was a quiet murmur of agreement. "And yet," she continued, "he stands here and says, 'I watched, I waited, I adjusted.'" The murmurs faded. Arath looked back at Dorn. "Do you understand why that is frustrating?" Dorn considered the question. "Yes." "Does that concern you?" "No." "Why not?" Dorn's answer came without hesitation this time. "Because it worked." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the chamber, this time not restrained, not embarrassed. It was brief but real. Arath allowed it, her expression calm but no longer entirely distant. "You are aware," she said, "that this is not how most people operate." "Yes." "Do you think they should?" Dorn paused again, that familiar, thoughtful silence. "No." Arath raised an eyebrow slightly. "No?" "They have their own ways," Dorn said. "This one is mine." Another quiet shift in the room. Not agreement, not disagreement. Something else. Acceptance, perhaps. Or the beginning of it. Arath studied him for a long moment, her gaze steady, her mind moving through possibilities that did not fit neatly into any structure she had been taught. "You do not seek to change anything," she said. Dorn shook his head. "No. And yet," she added softly, "you already have." Dorn tilted his head slightly. "Have I?" Arath glanced briefly at her advisors, her tacticians, her court, people who were now looking at Dorn not with confusion, but with something far more complicated. Yes, she said. Dorn followed her gaze, then looked back at her. I didn't mean to, he said. Arath smiled faintly. I know, she replied, and for reasons she could not yet explain, that made it far more significant. The chamber finally emptied, though not because anyone had reached a natural conclusion. It emptied because Queen Arath dismissed them, and when she did, even curiosity had to obey. Only a few remained. Dorn, exactly where he had been. Arath, now seated again, though not in the same way as before. There was less distance in her posture, less ceremony in the angle of her shoulders. Her long ears rested in a neutral position, no longer signaling to an audience, only listening, and two advisors who had not yet realized they were supposed to leave. You may go, Arath said without looking at them. They left quickly. Silence settled, but it was no longer the heavy, official silence of the court. It was quieter, less structured, almost comfortable. Dorn shifted his weight slightly, as if acknowledging that the room had changed shape. Arath watched him. You are not relieved, she said. Dorn blinked once. From what? From the court's attention. I wasn't uncomfortable. That is not what I asked. Dorn considered that. I don't feel different. Arath nodded slowly, as if confirming something for herself. Yes, that is becoming a pattern. She gestured toward a smaller projection, one that appeared between them rather than above. It showed a cluster of data points, fleet movements, resource distributions, communication delays. This is not a past battle, she said. It is a current situation. Dorn looked at it. Minor instability along the outer trade routes, she continued. Nothing that requires immediate intervention, but it is inefficient. Dorn nodded slightly. There's a delay here, he said, pointing to a section of the map. Arath's ears tilted forward. Yes. It compounds, Dorn added. Yes. A brief pause. You're already solving it, she said. Dorn glanced at her. I'm looking at it. That is how it starts. Dorn didn't argue. Arath leaned back slightly, studying him in a way that felt less like analysis and more like comparison. She had spent years surrounded by individuals who sought power, recognition, influence. They spoke in layers, moved with intention, calculated outcomes before actions. Dorn did none of those things, and yet outcomes seemed to follow him anyway. Tell me something, she said. Dorn waited. If I offered you a command position, fleet oversight, strategic authority, direct influence over these systems, what would you say? Dorn thought about it. No. Arath did not react immediately. No. I don't need it. That is not the same as not wanting it. Dorn considered that distinction. I don't want it. Arath's gaze sharpened slightly. Why? Dorn looked at the projection again. This is already happening. Yes. I can still see it. Yes. I don't need a different position to do that. Arath's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of her seat. You understand that authority allows you to act on what you see. Dorn nodded. I already can. Arath paused. That answer did not fit. You are not in the command structure, she said. No. You do not issue orders. No. And yet you act. Yes. Arath leaned forward slightly. How? Dorn shrugged, a small, almost apologetic motion. I talk to people. There was a silence. Arath stared at him. That is your explanation? It works. She let out a slow breath, something between amusement and disbelief. You navigate complex military structures by talking to people. Dorn nodded. They usually understand. Arath's lips curved faintly. Usually. Sometimes I have to explain twice. A quiet laugh escaped her, unguarded this time. You are either describing an elegant system, she said, or a complete absence of one. Dorn tilted his head slightly. Does it matter? Arath studied him again, that same question returning in a different form. Yes, she said softly. It does. Dorn waited, as if expecting her to explain. She didn't. Instead, she shifted the projection, expanding the data into a wider view. Trade routes, communication nodes, distant colonies. The scale increased, the complexity rising with it. This is what I manage, she said. Dorn looked at it. It's a lot. That is an understatement, Dorn nodded. Yes. Arath watched him carefully. Does it look different to you? Dorn paused. Yes, he said. How? Dorn gestured slightly, not at a specific point, but at the whole. It's all connected. Arath's ears moved subtly. Of course it is. No, Dorn said. Not like that. She leaned forward. Explain. Dorn hesitated, searching for the right words, not because he didn't understand, but because he was trying to match something internal to something external. If you change one part, he said slowly, the others don't just react. They shift. That is basic systems behavior. Yes, but you're saying something else. Dorn nodded. You don't need to control everything, just the right part. Arath's gaze sharpened. And you know which part is right. Sometimes. And when you don't, I wait. There it was again. Arath leaned back, her expression thoughtful. You are very patient, she said. Dorn shook his head slightly. No. No? I just don't rush. Arath smiled faintly. That is another way of saying the same thing. Dorn considered that. Maybe. A quiet pause settled between them. Then unexpectedly, Arath stood. She stepped closer to the projection, then past it, closing the distance between herself and Dorn until they stood within the same space of light. Her long ears angled forward, not in formality, but in focus. You are not trying to lead, she said. No. You are not trying to influence. No. You are not trying to be recognized. No. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slightly as if confirming something that had taken time to form. And yet, she said, you do all three. Dorn blinked once. I didn't notice. Arath's smile returned, small but certain. Yes, she said, that is exactly the problem. Dorn looked at her, waiting. Arath turned back toward the projection, her expression shifting. Not heavier, but clearer. For the first time, she said quietly, I am considering the possibility that control is not the same as understanding. Dorn nodded. It isn't. Arath glanced at him. You say that very easily. It's simple. She let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. Yes, she said, you would say that. And for a moment, the vast complexity of an interstellar empire felt slightly less complicated than it had before. By the next cycle, Dorn had become a problem. Not a dangerous one, not a disruptive one. Those would have been easier to categorize. But a structural problem, the kind that quietly rearranged expectations without asking permission. The court did not announce this realization. It emerged gradually, like a system discovering a flaw in its own design. It began with conversations. Have you noticed, one officer whispered to another, that he doesn't ask for anything? Yes, that's not normal. I know. A third voice joined, quieter. I tried giving him something. Both turned. What happened? He said thank you. That's it? That's it. A pause. What did you give him? A commendation. And? He asked where to put it. The two officers stared. What did you tell him? I said, on his record. And? He said, it's already there. A silence followed that conversation, the kind that suggested something important had just occurred, though no one was entirely sure what. Elsewhere, in a different section of the palace, a group of engineers reviewed a recent adjustment to the outer trade routes. Efficiency had increased by 12%. Transit delays had dropped. Resource allocation had stabilized. No one had ordered the change. Who authorized this? One engineer asked. Another checked the logs. No one. That's not possible. A third engineer leaned closer. Wait, this adjustment, these routes, this pattern. He paused. I've seen this before. Where? The engineer hesitated. In a battle report. The others exchanged looks. Which one? His. They did not say Dorn's name. They didn't need to. Meanwhile, Dorn was in a corridor explaining something to a logistics officer who looked increasingly overwhelmed. So you're saying, the officer said slowly, that if we move the supply chain 2 cycles earlier, it removes the delay. But that delay isn't critical. It becomes critical later. The officer blinked. Later when? Dorn shrugged lightly. When it's too late to fix it? The officer stared at him. That's not helpful. Dorn nodded. It will be. The officer closed his eyes briefly. You're doing it again. Doing what? Making things sound simple when they're not. Dorn thought about that. I can make it sound more complicated. No, don't do that. Dorn nodded. Okay. A pause. But it is simple. The officer made a small noise that could have been a laugh or a cry for help. The changes continued. Small adjustments, minor corrections, conversations that led to actions that led to outcomes no one had formally approved, but no one could argue with. The court began to notice. Not because Dorn announced anything, because things stopped going wrong. Queen Arath stood at the edge of a wide observation platform, looking out over the capital's orbital structures. Ships moved in precise formations, their paths cleaner now, their timing sharper. Her long ears tilted slightly as she listened, not to voices, but to patterns. The flow of movement, the rhythm of coordination. It had changed. Behind her, an advisor approached cautiously. Your Majesty, yes, there have been developments. I am aware, the advisor hesitated. We are trying to understand them. Arath turned slightly. And? We cannot find a central command? Arath's expression remained calm. There isn't one. That is the problem. No, she said softly. That is the answer. The advisor blinked, uncertain whether that was reassuring. In several cases, he continued, personnel report receiving suggestions, not orders, not directives, just suggestions. Yes, they follow them. Yes, and the outcomes are optimal. Yes. The advisor hesitated again. This is not how our system is designed to function. Arath's gaze drifted back to the moving fleets. No, she agreed. It isn't. A pause. Should we intervene? The advisor asked. Arath considered the question. No. The advisor exhaled, not quite relieved. Then what should we do? Arath's lips curved faintly. Observe. Behind them, footsteps approached. Dorn. He stopped a respectful distance away, though it did not feel like distance in the same way it had before. You wanted to see me, he said. Arath nodded. Yes. The advisor stepped aside, though he remained close enough to listen. No one stopped him. Arath gestured toward the orbital structures. Do you see anything unusual? Dorn looked. A few seconds passed. They're smoother, he said. Smoother, the advisor repeated quietly, as if testing the word. Yes, Dorn said. Less correction. Arath watched him. Why? Dorn shrugged lightly. They're not fighting the system. The advisor frowned. They were never fighting the system. Dorn glanced at him. They were. How? They were trying to control everything. That is the purpose of the system. Dorn shook his head slightly. That's the problem. A silence followed. Arath stepped closer to the edge of the platform, her gaze steady. You have not issued a single command. No. You have not requested authority. No. And yet, she said, the system is changing. Dorn nodded. Yes. Why? Dorn paused. They're paying attention. The advisor blinked. To what? Dorn looked at him. To what's actually happening. Another silence. Arath's ears shifted subtly, catching the tone beneath his words. Not pride, not ownership, just observation. You didn't tell them what to do, she said. No. You showed them what to notice. Dorn considered that. I guess. The advisor let out a slow breath. That's worse. Arath glanced at him. Worse? It means we can't control it. Arath's expression softened slightly. No, she said. It means we never did. The advisor fell quiet. Dorn looked between them, as if trying to determine whether this was a problem. Should I stop? He asked. The question hung in the air. Arath turned to him fully now, her gaze steady, her posture no longer that of a distant ruler, but something more precise. No, she said. Dorn nodded once. Okay. A pause. Unless you want me to. Arath almost laughed. No, she repeated. I don't. Dorn nodded again, satisfied. They stood there for a moment longer, watching the movement of ships, the quiet flow of a system that had begun to understand itself differently. Then Dorn spoke again, almost as an afterthought. There's still a delay in the outer routes. The advisor made a small, tired sound. Of course there is. Arath didn't look away from the horizon. Will it resolve? Dorn watched for a few seconds. Yes. How? Dorn shrugged. Someone will notice it. The advisor closed his eyes. Arath smiled just slightly. And for the first time, the uncertainty did not feel like something to eliminate. It felt like something that might finally be understood. The final report waited on Queen Arath's desk longer than any document had a right to. It was not large. It did not demand attention. It did not attempt to impress her with polished language or layered meaning. If anything, it seemed to resist importance, sitting there quietly as if it had already decided it would not compete with anything else in the room. Arath studied it without touching it. Around her, the palace moved with a new rhythm. Subtle, efficient, almost self-aware. Systems no longer strained against themselves. Fleets adjusted before conflicts formed. Conversations carried weight without needing authority to enforce them. Nothing had been officially changed. Everything had. Her long ears shifted slightly as she listened to the distant hum of the capital's orbitals. It was smoother now, not silent, never silent, but aligned in a way that felt intentional without being forced. Behind her, an advisor stood with careful patience. Your Majesty, he said softly, the audit is complete. I know, Arath replied. There was a pause. We are prepared to formalize the conclusions. Arath glanced at him. Are we? The advisor hesitated. We have prepared several classifications. I'm sure you have. He stepped forward slightly, activating a display. Titles appeared. Commendations, ranks, distinctions, newly proposed categories designed to contain something that did not naturally fit. Arath looked at them. They are all incorrect, she said. The advisor blinked. Your Majesty? They assume this is something that can be defined. A pause. Is it not? Arath turned her gaze back to the report on her desk. No. The advisor shifted, uncertain. Then how should it be recorded? Arath reached forward at last, her fingers resting lightly on the surface of the report. She did not open it immediately. Accurately, she said. The advisor frowned slightly. With respect, Your Majesty, accuracy is what has led to this difficulty. Arath's lips curved faintly. Yes. She opened the report. The same lines greeted her. Engaged hostile force, reduced threat, secured survivors, no embellishment, no narrative, no attempt to shape perception, just what happened. Arath exhaled slowly. For the first time, she understood it. Not as a limitation, not as a lack, but as a choice. Not his choice. A different kind of truth. Leave it, she said. The advisor blinked. Leave it? As it is. No additions? No. No formal recognition? Arath looked up at him. Would it change anything? The advisor opened his mouth, then paused. No, he admitted. Then it is unnecessary. The advisor hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. He deactivated the display, the carefully constructed titles disappearing as if they had never been real to begin with. After a moment, he spoke again. There is one more matter. Arath raised an eyebrow slightly. There always is. The court has begun referring to him as the Quiet Storm. Arath closed her eyes briefly. Of course they have, she said. It has spread beyond the court. I'm sure it has. The advisor waited as if expecting a response. Arath opened her eyes. Does he know? Yes. And? The advisor hesitated. He said storms are loud. Arath laughed, not the restrained, measured sound of a queen, but something lighter, something unguarded. Yes, she said. That sounds like him. The advisor allowed himself a small smile, then straightened. Shall we correct the designation? Arath considered that. No. No. Let them call him what they need to call him. And him. Arath glanced back at the report. He will remain what he is. The advisor nodded, understanding more than he could explain. He left quietly. The room settled again. A moment later, Dorn entered. No announcement, no ceremony, just presence. "You wanted to see me," he said. Arath looked at him, really looked this time, not as a subject, not as an anomaly, but as something she had spent time trying to understand and had finally stopped trying to define. "Yes," she said. Dorn waited. Arath gestured to the report. "It is finished." Dorn glanced at it. "Okay." "I did not change it." Dorn nodded. "That makes sense." Arath watched him closely. "Does it?" "Yes." "Why?" Dorn shrugged lightly. "It's what happened." A small silence followed. Arath stepped closer, her long ears angled forward, her attention focused but no longer searching for something hidden. "I could have given you a title," she said. Dorn nodded. "Yes." "I could have assigned you a position." "Yes." "I could have made you important." Dorn considered that. "I think I already am." Arath paused, then she smiled. "Yes," she said. "You are." Another quiet moment passed. "Does that bother you?" she asked. Dorn shook his head. "No." "Should it?" Dorn thought about it. "I don't think so." Arath nodded slowly. For a long time she had believed that power required visibility, recognition, structure, that to lead was to be seen, to be acknowledged, to shape the system from above. Now she was no longer certain. "You've changed things," she said. Dorn glanced around the room, then back at her. "I didn't mean to." "I know." A pause. "That doesn't make it less real." Dorn nodded once. They stood there, not as queen and soldier, not as authority and subject, but as two individuals looking at the same system from different angles, and, somehow, arriving at the same understanding. "There will be more problems," Arath said. "Yes." "You will notice them." "Yes." "You will not report them properly." Dorn blinked. "I think I will." Arath raised an eyebrow. Dorn paused. "Probably not." Arath laughed again, softer this time. "Good," she said. Dorn nodded, satisfied. He turned to leave, then stopped. "There is still a delay in the outer routes," he said. Arath didn't look surprised. "I know. It's getting smaller." "Yes." A pause. "Someone noticed it," Dorn added. Arath's smile returned, quiet but certain. "Yes," she said. "They did." Dorn nodded once more, then left the room the same way he had entered, without ceremony, without weight, without trying to be anything other than what he was. The doors closed behind him. Arath remained where she was, her gaze resting on the report one last time. Then she deactivated the display. No edits, no additions. Just the truth. Outside, the fleets moved. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but with a kind of understanding that had not been there before. And for the first time, Arath did not feel the need to control it. She only watched. And that, she realized, was enough.